The invitation came on a Monday, tucked between the usual clutter of unread emails and end-of-semester announcements. A short message from Elijah, my cousin, someone I hadn't spoken to much since we were both still awkward teenagers sitting at opposite ends of family reunions. He said I could come stay at his place for a while, that he had the space and that it might do me good to get away for a bit. At first, I hesitated, rereading his message with cautious curiosity. But then I looked around my cluttered dorm room, books stacked in collapsing towers, a suitcase still half unpacked from spring break, and the constant hum of city noise bleeding through the cracked window, and I felt something shift. A quiet pull. Like the idea of silence had suddenly become the most seductive sound in the world. I packed in silence, choosing clothes not for style but for comfort. Loose shirts, old jeans, soft cotton, and a hoodie that still smelled faintly like the soap from home. The road stretched ahead like a long exhale. My car hummed beneath me as I drove out of the city, watching as the sharp lines of buildings gave way to open skies and the unhurried rhythm of green fields. The farther I got, the lighter I felt, like I was slowly peeling off layers I hadn't realized I was wearing. It was a long drive, but I didn't mind. The radio played softly, a low accompaniment to my wandering thoughts, and the occasional billboard passed like punctuation marks in a story I didn't yet know I was writing. When I pulled up to the house, it was early evening, that strange hour when the world seems to pause for breath. Elijah's place sat at the edge of a quiet town, nestled among trees and tall grass, with a gravel driveway that crunched satisfyingly beneath my tires. It was an old house, painted white once but now faded and peeling in places, the wood showing through like a memory refusing to be forgotten. The porch wrapped around the front like an embrace, and the steps creaked softly when I climbed them. Wind stirred the chimes hanging by the door, their delicate clinking a sound that immediately made me feel like I had stepped into another lifetime. He came to the door before I could knock, and we exchanged a look that lasted longer than it should have. Not awkward. Not exactly warm either. Just, observing. Measuring the space between what we remembered and what we were now. He was different, taller maybe, or maybe just more comfortable in his skin. His hair was longer than I remembered, and his shoulders filled out in a way that suggested quiet strength. There was something about the way he stood, not tense but aware, like a tree that had grown tall simply because no one told it not to. The guest room was upstairs, tucked into the corner of the house, with a window that looked out over the trees. I unpacked slowly, letting my fingers linger on each item as I placed it into drawers that smelled faintly of cedar. The floorboards creaked under my weight, the sound strangely comforting. Outside, birds called to each other in the fading light, and somewhere downstairs, I could hear Elijah moving through the kitchen. The rhythm of it all was so different from what I had grown used to. No cars honking, no endless notifications buzzing in my pocket, no voices echoing from the hallway. Just this soft, measured quiet that wrapped itself around me like a blanket worn thin from use. I wandered the house after settling in, letting my hand brush along the wooden banister, tracing the patterns in the wallpaper that curled slightly at the edges. The living room held signs of someone who lived thoughtfully, books stacked with care, a worn armchair positioned perfectly beneath a lamp, a pair of headphones resting beside a record player. I felt like I was walking through a life that had chosen simplicity over spectacle, solitude over noise. And somehow, I didn't feel like a guest. I felt like a page being turned. Dinner was ready just as the sun began to slip below the horizon. We ate outside, on the porch, the air still warm and heavy with the scent of earth and summer. The sky bled colors slowly, first gold, then pink, then a soft bruise of purple that settled into the trees. Fireflies blinked at the edges of the yard, and the cicadas began their slow, rhythmic song. I watched Elijah as he moved, how easily he seemed to exist in this space. He didn't fill the silence with words or apologies. He let it be. And that quiet, at first so unfamiliar, began to settle into my bones. That night, I lay in the unfamiliar bed and stared at the ceiling, the faint pattern of moonlight drifting through the sheer curtains. I listened to the house breathing around me, the creak of the wooden beams, the occasional rustle of leaves outside, the faint sound of water running in the pipes. Somewhere down the hall, a door clicked softly shut. I told myself it was just a house, just my cousin, just a visit. But something inside me whispered otherwise. It was the way the air felt thicker, the way my skin still tingled from sunlight and open space. It was the way his eyes had lingered for a moment too long when we passed each other near the stairs. I tried to shake it off, to let exhaustion pull me under. But the quiet carried weight, and beneath it, something else had begun to stir, something unnamed, quiet as breath, but impossible to ignore. The morning light seeped in through the thin white curtains like a quiet presence, casting pale golden lines across the wooden floor. The air felt still, suspended, like the house itself had yet to wake fully. I sat up slowly, the sheets tangled around my waist, and listened. No traffic, no voices, no alarms. Just the distant hum of insects and the faint creaking of old beams settling into place. My body felt both rested and strangely alert, as though my skin remembered something my thoughts hadn't yet caught up to. I dressed without thinking, my fingers moving slowly, deliberately, as if stalling for time I didn't know I was measuring. Downstairs, the house remained hushed. A breeze slipped through the open kitchen window, carrying with it the scent of cut grass and warm earth. I poured a cup of coffee and let it warm my hands as I stood barefoot on the porch. The sky was pale and endless. Fields stretched out toward the tree line, shimmering faintly under the early sun. Everything around me felt open, exposed, but not in a threatening way. More like the world had forgotten to put up walls. I leaned against the porch rail, sipping slowly, watching the quiet shift of shadows in the yard, until the screen door creaked behind me. I didn't turn. I didn't need to. He passed through the kitchen without saying anything, a towel slung over his shoulder, a bottle of shampoo in hand. His presence moved through the air like a current. I heard his footsteps on the stairs, the slow creak of each wooden step under his weight. The hallway above echoed softly with his movements. And then the sound of the bathroom door opening, the tap of the handle, the hush of it closing behind him. A moment later, the shower turned on. The rush of water filled the silence like a held breath being released. I stayed there, cup half raised, gaze unfocused. My skin prickled with a strange awareness, a quiet vibration beneath the surface. I told myself it was nothing. A house with one bathroom. A cousin taking a shower. But the logic felt hollow, like a thin layer stretched too tight over something deeper. I walked inside without fully deciding to. My body moved ahead of my thoughts, down the hall to the foot of the stairs. I paused, fingers resting lightly on the banister. The water was still running. The door wasn't locked. My heart thudded a little harder. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step deliberate. The hallway at the top was dim, the light from the bathroom spilling out in a soft glow. Steam curled lazily from the gap beneath the door. The scent of warm water and cedar soap hung in the air. I stood there for a second, maybe longer. Long enough to hear the subtle shifts in movement from inside. Long enough to feel the heat of the room leaking through the cracks, touching my face, my chest, my hands. I reached for the door and opened it quietly. The room was thick with steam, a warm haze clinging to every surface. The mirror had fogged over completely, and droplets slid down the glass like the softest kind of rain. The walls dripped gently, and the tiles beneath my feet were slick and warm. I closed the door behind me, the click impossibly loud in the mist. I didn't speak. I didn't move toward the shower. I didn't even look. I focused instead on folding my towel, setting it neatly on the small stool near the sink, adjusting the corner as if that act could anchor me. Behind the curtain, I could make out his silhouette. Vague, blurred, yet undeniably human. The shape of his shoulders. The angle of his back. The curve of muscle along his arm as he reached up to run fingers through his hair. My eyes lingered for a fraction too long before I turned away. The sound of water striking skin filled the room, steady and rhythmic, like a language I wasn't meant to understand but couldn't help listening to. I pretended to busy myself. I counted the tiles on the wall. I breathed in steam until my lungs ached. Then the water stopped. The sudden silence made everything else louder, the dripping, the thud of my heartbeat, the shift of fabric as the curtain rustled. I kept my eyes down, tracing a crack in the grout along the floor. He stepped out, quiet, sure, wrapped in a towel that clung low on his hips. I saw the wet trail he left behind, the sheen of moisture on his skin, the way his reflection flickered briefly in the edge of the mirror. And then he was gone. The door opened, closed. His absence made the room feel even warmer. I stood still for a long time, letting the silence settle again. My body felt like it didn't quite belong to me. My thoughts were sluggish, looping, unfinished. I turned on the water, adjusted the temperature until it felt right, hot, but not scalding, and stepped inside. The stream hit my shoulders, rolled down my back, and I let my head fall forward under its weight. I closed my eyes and tried to let the heat scrub everything away. But it didn't. The steam didn't blur what I'd seen. The water didn't cool the strange burn under my skin. I thought about the shape of his spine, the slow arc of his movement, the heaviness in the air when we had both been in that room. It had felt like something pressed between us, invisible but undeniable. I couldn't name it, couldn't claim it. But it was there. Alive. Pulsing softly beneath the surface of everything. When I stepped out, the mirror had cleared just enough for me to see myself. My face was flushed, my eyes too bright, too wide. I wrapped the towel around my waist, watched a single droplet trace its way down my collarbone. The room was empty, but it didn't feel like I was alone. There was something in the silence, in the echo of footsteps now gone, that lingered. I stood there until the air cooled, until my skin began to prickle with chill. But even then, the warmth under my ribs remained, steady and low, like a secret I hadn't meant to learn but couldn't unhear. The days began to blend together, each one bleeding softly into the next. The house settled into a rhythm I hadn't expected, quiet, unhurried, shaped by subtle routines and unspoken agreements. Morning started with the soft clinking of dishes in the kitchen, afternoons moved with the slow creak of floorboards, and evenings ended in a kind of suspended hush that stretched out long after the sun dipped below the trees. It wasn't a silence that demanded anything, it was a silence that waited, a silence that noticed. And I began to notice too, things I hadn't paid attention to before, small shifts, fleeting gestures, the way certain moments seemed to stretch and hold longer than they should. Elijah and I moved around each other like figures in a slow dance, always near, never quite touching. We shared space without crowding it. Cooking together became a quiet ritual, a choreography of passing knives and bowls, of wordless glances exchanged over bubbling pots. I caught myself watching him more than I should have, how his fingers moved with calm precision, how his eyes squinted slightly in concentration when slicing vegetables, how his posture shifted when he leaned against the counter, one hip cocked casually, unaware of the weight it carried in my mind. I tried not to linger too long. I tried to be casual. But the truth was, my gaze kept finding him like a compass needle locked on a single direction. We spent more time outside as the weather warmed. We mowed the lawn, trimmed the hedges, repaired a loose screen on the porch. The work gave me something to do with my hands, but it didn't quiet my thoughts. If anything, the closeness made them louder. Every time our shoulders brushed, even lightly, it sent a flicker of heat across my skin. Every time he leaned over to reach for something, I felt myself freeze for just a second too long. It wasn't desire in the loud, urgent sense, it was something quieter, deeper, a kind of magnetic pull that I couldn't explain and didn't know how to resist. And beneath all of it was the memory of the bathroom, of the steam, of the silence between us, thick and heavy with whatever had passed unspoken. One afternoon, we drove into town to pick up supplies. The ride was quiet, windows down, warm wind slipping through the car. Music played softly on the radio, something instrumental, barely there. At a red light, I turned to say something, but he was already looking at me. Just looking. Not startled. Not avoiding. Just holding the moment. I didn't speak. Neither did he. The light turned green, and he turned back to the road, but something had shifted. I felt it in the air between us, like a current passed from one body to another without a word. The rest of the drive continued in silence, but my thoughts spun like wheels stuck in gravel, unable to gain traction. That evening, we sat on the porch again, watching the sky bleed into dusk. The clouds turned from white to amber to deep gray, and the first stars began to push through the fabric of twilight. We sat far enough apart that it couldn't be called close, but not far enough to be casual. His arm rested along the back of the bench, not touching me, but near. I found myself tuning into the sound of his breathing, the way his chest rose and fell, the slow rhythm of it anchoring me in a moment that felt both endless and unbearably fragile. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare speak. My hands were still in my lap, but my mind reached toward him like a tide slipping over sand. Later, when we returned inside, he sat on the floor of the living room with a book in his lap. The lamp cast a soft circle of light around him, and I stood in the doorway for a long moment before taking my place on the couch. I pretended to scroll through my phone, but I wasn't reading anything. I was listening, to the turn of pages, to the subtle shifts of his body, to the way his presence seemed to fill the room without pressing into it. I looked up and met his gaze again. He didn't look away. His eyes held mine for just a heartbeat too long, and something inside me cracked open, quietly, without fanfare, like a door easing on its hinges. The look wasn't questioning or even inviting. It was knowing. As if he saw everything I hadn't said, hadn't admitted, not even to myself. And in that instant, I felt stripped bare, not in a way that made me shrink, but in a way that made me feel seen. Truly seen. I swallowed hard and dropped my gaze, pretending to adjust the blanket over my legs, pretending my face wasn't flushed. He didn't move. The air buzzed faintly, alive with things unspoken. When I finally climbed the stairs to my room, the hallway felt narrower than usual. The distance between our rooms felt charged, like a line drawn in chalk waiting to be smudged. I undressed slowly, aware of every breath, every heartbeat, every flicker of thought I couldn't contain. I stood at the window for a long time, staring out at the fields bathed in moonlight, and tried to make sense of the quiet storm inside me. I didn't understand it, not completely. I only knew that something was happening, between us, within me, and no matter how many times I tried to explain it away, it kept growing, persistent and undeniable, in the spaces between our glances. The day unfolded slowly, like a thread being pulled gently through fabric, the hours stretching without resistance. Morning came with the same soft light and the scent of brewing coffee drifting through the halls. I moved through the kitchen in silence, barefoot, the cool floor grounding me. Outside, the world was wrapped in stillness, no wind, no distant cars, just the steady hum of insects and the occasional rustle of leaves. It felt like everything around us had paused, as if waiting for something unnamed to happen. Elijah spent most of the morning working on something in the shed. I watched him from the porch for a while, the way his body moved with purpose, the slow grace of someone used to being alone but not burdened by it. His shirt clung to his back where the sweat had gathered, and I turned away before my gaze lingered too long. I wandered inside, restless, drifting from room to room as if I might stumble across a reason for the weight building quietly in my chest. Every sound, every glance, every moment from the past few days hung in the air like static. I could feel it in my fingertips, in the back of my throat, in the base of my spine. By early evening, the sky began its familiar transformation, soft gold bleeding into rose and then into the smoky blue of twilight. The house dimmed with it, shadows curling in the corners, stretching along the floor like liquid. I found myself drawn to the porch again, the place where silence had become its own kind of language between us. I sat there, watching the horizon, the outlines of trees darkening against the sky. My thoughts churned, slow and heavy, like clouds gathering before a storm. I heard the screen door creak behind me. I didn't need to turn to know it was him. His steps were measured, deliberate, the kind of footsteps that didn't need to announce themselves. He sat beside me, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his skin but not touching. For a while, we said nothing. Or maybe we were speaking in some other way, in the stillness, in the way our arms rested close, in the way our breath seemed to fall into rhythm. The space between us was no longer neutral. It was charged, humming with everything we hadn't said and everything we had already admitted in the way we looked at each other. The wind picked up slightly, just enough to stir the grass and send a few dry leaves tumbling across the porch. I kept my eyes fixed ahead, pretending to study the line of trees in the distance, but I was aware of him in the smallest ways, the shift of his weight, the soft exhale of breath through his nose, the way his hand was now resting on the bench near mine. Not touching, but near. So near that I could feel its presence like heat. I didn't know when my hand moved. Maybe it didn't. Maybe it was his. Maybe it was both. But suddenly, our knuckles brushed. A feather-light touch. Barely more than a whisper of contact. My heart stopped, stuttered, then raced. The touch lingered, then deepened, slowly, hesitantly, until our fingers found each other, not interlaced but resting together, like the tentative beginning of a sentence neither of us knew how to finish. We stayed like that for what felt like hours. Nothing else moved. The world had narrowed to the warmth of his skin against mine, the shared silence, the low thrum of blood in my ears. My breathing was shallow, my chest tight with the effort of staying still. I turned my head slightly, and our eyes met. There was no surprise in his expression. No fear. Just a quiet, steady knowing. He wasn't asking. He wasn't assuming. He was waiting. I don't know what he saw in my face, but whatever it was, it didn't make him look away. The space between us closed like a held breath finally released. Our foreheads touched, the contact light and deliberate. A slow lean, like gravity had finally been given permission to do what it had wanted to do all along. I felt the warmth of his skin against mine, the slow steady rhythm of his breath. My eyes closed, not from fear but from surrender. It wasn't overwhelming. It wasn't confusing. It was grounding, anchoring, like I had finally stepped into something I had been circling for days. His lips met mine with a softness I wasn't prepared for. No urgency, no demand. Just presence. A quiet question offered without pressure. My response came not from thought but from instinct, from the deep place where longing hides. I leaned in, returned the kiss with the same careful honesty. There was no rush. No choreography. Just the slow unfolding of something that had been waiting beneath the surface, blooming in the dark. We stayed like that, connected, still, breathing each other in. Our fingers slowly entwined, palms pressing together in silent confirmation. The sky deepened into night, the stars beginning to flicker above us like signals from another world. The porch was no longer just wood and nails, it was a vessel, a container for something sacred and terrifying and undeniable. When we finally parted, we didn't speak. Words felt unnecessary, too fragile to hold what we had just shared. We sat there in the dark, hands still touching, the silence between us fuller than it had ever been. I felt the shift inside me like a line moving beneath my feet, a quiet tectonic adjustment I couldn't undo. I didn't want to. I had crossed into something new, uncertain, vast, and real. And even though I didn't know where this would lead, I knew I couldn't return to where I had been. The line had moved. And I had moved with it. I woke with the sense that the world had shifted slightly during the night. The light filtering through the curtains was the same soft gold, the distant sounds of birds and insects unchanged, but something inside me was different. I lay still for a long time, staring at the ceiling, my body caught between stillness and the subtle hum of memory. The air in the room felt heavier than usual, not in a suffocating way, but in a way that suggested it now carried more than just oxygen. It carried meaning. It carried the weight of everything that had passed between us the night before. I rose slowly, moving through my morning routine with care, as though each motion could anchor me to this new internal landscape. My reflection in the bathroom mirror looked no different, but I could feel the difference under my skin. A low thrum, a quiet certainty that I had crossed a boundary not only between him and me, but within myself. I tried to name the feeling, but no word seemed to fit. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't fear. It was something quieter, deeper, like the steady pressure of deep water pressing inward from all sides. Downstairs, the house smelled of toast and coffee. The kitchen was warm with morning light, the same as every other day, and yet nothing felt the same. Elijah wasn't in the room when I entered, but I could hear the soft clink of tools in the backyard, the dull rhythm of him hammering something near the shed. I poured myself a cup of coffee and stood by the window, watching his movements through the screen. He moved with the same calm focus he always had, but now every gesture held a different weight for me. I knew what his hands felt like. I knew the sound of his breath close to mine. That knowledge shimmered behind my eyes, warm and unshakable. He looked up once, as if sensing my gaze, and our eyes met. It was just a glance, a brief moment of connection, but it carried a quiet acknowledgement. No shame. No panic. Just a shared knowing. I turned away before the moment stretched too long, my fingers tightening around the warm mug in my hands. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like a continuation, like the conversation we hadn't needed words for the night before was still unfolding, silently, across the rooms of the house. The day passed in fragments. We worked on opposite ends of the yard, crossed paths in the hallway, stood side by side while picking vegetables from the garden. We spoke little, but when we did, our voices were softer, slower, as if adjusting to a new frequency. There was no attempt to define what had happened, no need to dissect it. Everything in our movements felt unhurried, deliberate. Every glance that lingered said enough. The tension that had once buzzed beneath our interactions had been replaced by something steadier. A low, steady current that bound us without pulling too tightly. In the late afternoon, we drove into town for supplies. The sun was high, casting sharp shadows across the road. The ride was quiet, the windows down, warm air whipping through the car. We didn't speak much, but the silence wasn't empty. It was full, like a song without lyrics. At one point, we both reached for the same item in the store, a bottle of juice, and our fingers brushed. A small thing. A nothing, really. But I felt it all the way up my arm, a pulse that seemed to echo in my chest. Neither of us pulled away quickly. We just let the moment pass naturally, like we had begun to understand that not everything needed to be named to be real. Back at the house, the golden light of evening spread across the porch as we unloaded the car. The sky was beginning its descent into dusk, the horizon smeared with soft pinks and violets. I watched the way the light played across his face, softening the lines, catching in the strands of his hair. He looked peaceful. At ease. I wondered if I looked the same, or if the whirlwind inside me was somehow visible in my posture, in the way my hands kept fidgeting, in the way I stood just a little closer to him than I used to. That evening, we ended up on the porch again, not touching, not speaking. We sat in the same positions as the night before, but now the space between us was not a question, it was an answer. A quiet confirmation that we had entered something new and were learning how to hold it without letting it break. The sounds of the night rose around us, the steady hum of cicadas, the occasional rustle of wind through the trees, the distant bark of a dog far down the road. And beneath it all, the sound of our breathing, slow and steady, like two parts of a single rhythm. When I went to bed that night, the room felt smaller than it had before, or maybe I had just grown larger inside it. I lay down and stared at the ceiling again, but this time there was no tension in my chest. No looping thoughts or scattered doubts. There was only the memory of his hand in mine, the warmth of his forehead against mine, the steady quiet that had passed between us like a vow without words. I didn't know what came next. I didn't know if this would last, or if it would stay suspended in this small window of time like a fragile summer bloom. But I knew what I felt. I knew I was no longer standing at the edge of something. I had stepped in. And whatever waited beyond, I wasn't afraid of it. Not anymore. I had taken the step, and for the first time in a long time, I felt whole. The last day arrived without warning, quiet and unassuming, wrapped in the same soft light that had greeted every morning before it. But even before I opened my eyes, I felt the difference. There was a stillness in the air, not just the absence of sound but the heaviness of something ending. It rested over my chest like a folded blanket, gentle but impossible to ignore. I stayed in bed longer than usual, not out of tiredness but because the act of moving would begin the inevitable unraveling of the hours ahead. My breath came slow and deliberate, and my fingers curled around the edge of the sheet like it might tether me to the moment a little longer. When I finally rose, the light filtering through the window was pale and clear, the kind that sharpened every edge and deepened every shadow. The suitcase stood open in the corner, half packed from the night before, its gaping mouth a quiet reminder that time had run out. I moved slowly, folding each piece of clothing with care, smoothing out creases that didn't matter. I found myself pausing over small items, socks, a t-shirt, the book I hadn't finished, as if they might offer some excuse to stay a little longer. The room felt different now. Not unfamiliar, but changed. The walls had absorbed too much. The bed carried the shape of memories I hadn't expected to make. Every object had been touched by something I couldn't take with me. Downstairs, the house was mostly quiet. The kitchen bore signs of a morning already in motion, a plate in the sink, the faint scent of toast in the air, the low hum of the refrigerator. I moved through the space like a ghost, touching things lightly, opening and closing cabinets without purpose. Outside the window, I saw him. Elijah stood near the shed, hands in his pockets, staring out toward the tree line. His posture was relaxed, but there was a weight in the way he held himself, a kind of bracing. He didn't move. Neither did I. We were both waiting for something we didn't have a name for. We spent most of the day in silence. It wasn't cold or distant. It was the kind of silence that holds the echoes of everything already said. We moved around each other without the need for instruction, tending to small tasks, sharing the same spaces without filling them with unnecessary noise. We passed each other in the hallway, our shoulders brushing with the barest touch. We worked side by side in the garden, hands moving through the soil, the sun warm on our backs. Every glance, every brief contact, was layered with memory. The day was full, but not busy. It was the fullness of presence, of being in something even as it slipped away. In the late afternoon, I walked the gravel path that led toward the woods, my feet crunching softly with each step. The air was cooler beneath the trees, the sky a soft gray overhead, the light diffused and gentle. I didn't have a destination. I just walked, letting the quiet pull me deeper into myself. The path twisted and turned, familiar in its simplicity, and I let my mind wander through the days I had spent here. I thought about the first night I arrived, how I had expected nothing but rest and stillness. I hadn't expected the silence to speak so loudly. I hadn't expected my own heart to shift in the quiet. When I returned, the sun was already beginning its descent, casting long shadows across the yard. The house glowed softly, windows lit with golden light. My aunt had returned and was moving about in the kitchen, her presence grounding the space in a comforting kind of normalcy. I passed her on my way upstairs, offering a quiet nod. She didn't ask questions. She never had. In my room, I zipped the suitcase shut with a sound that felt too final. I sat on the edge of the bed for a while, staring at the pattern of light on the floor, listening to the distant clatter of dishes, the occasional creak of the porch. Time was folding in on itself, and all I could do was let it. Later, as I carried my things to the porch, he was there. Elijah stood near the edge of the steps, hands in his pockets again, eyes on the fading sky. The light caught his profile, softened the angles of his face, lit the curve of his jaw in quiet gold. We didn't speak. We didn't reach out. We simply stood in the silence that had become ours. A silence that held everything, what had happened, what hadn't, what couldn't. I looked at him and tried to memorize it all. The slope of his shoulders. The way the wind moved through his hair. The expression on his face that held both strength and tenderness, certainty and restraint. There was no ceremony. No farewell. Just the slow motion of bodies preparing to part. He walked with me to the car, our footsteps in rhythm, the gravel crunching softly beneath our feet. The trunk opened, closed. The engine idled quietly. I gripped the steering wheel too tightly, my knuckles pale. Still, we didn't speak. But when I looked up, his eyes found mine. And in that look was everything I couldn't say. Gratitude. Sadness. The ache of something unfinished. A quiet kind of love that had no place to land. I drove away without looking back. The house disappeared behind the trees, swallowed by the curve of the road. The sky darkened as I drove, shadows thickening along the edges of the landscape. Inside the car, there was no music. Only the low hum of the engine and the sound of my own breath, steady and real. My hand stayed on the wheel, but my thoughts stayed behind, on the porch, on the shared silence, on the warmth of a touch that had changed everything. The distance grew, but the feeling didn't fade. It stayed with me, quiet and persistent, like a thread tied around my ribs. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know if we would ever speak of it again. But I knew I had been seen. I knew I had allowed myself to feel something true. And even though the road ahead was long and uncertain, I didn't feel lost. I felt altered. Not by love in the way stories often tell it, but by connection. By the rare, quiet moment when two people see each other fully and choose, even briefly, to stay in that vision. That was the last day. It didn't end with clarity or resolution. It ended with a kind of ache that I didn't want to erase. An ache that reminded me I had lived something real. Something soft. Something mine.